Hello there, and welcome to our special coverage about the Russia-Ukraine file, coming to you live on All 24 News with me, Karifat Zachary. NATO's door remains open to any European country in a position to undertake commitments and obligations of membership and contribute to security in the Euro-Atlantic area, with a Western infinite support and some allies objecting to new memberships. U.S. President Joe Biden's trip to South Korea and Japan aimed to build rapport with the two nations' leaders while sending an unmistakable message to China. Russia's faltering invasion of Ukraine should give Beijing pause about its own saber-rattling in the Pacific and stop any support for Russian invasion, with inflation, food shortage, and economic crisis around the world caused by the current war. All this is going to be analyzed today in our special coverage. I am joined live via Skype by Alessandro Gargadisse, an Italian international security and geopolitical analyst from Hungary. And from Mississippi, USA, we are joined by Dr. Kevin Rila, a professor at Mississippi University Center for Intelligence and Security Studies. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. The discussion after this break. And before we delve into a discussion, let me share with you the latest on the ground. The eastern region of Ukraine has seen a major advancement of Russian troops, as the latter marked its strong grip after the surrender of over 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers. The Russian-appointed leader of the Kherson region says the region will soon become part of the Russian Federation. The Russian army is preparing for a new wave in their military operation to expand to the center of Ukraine. Mr. Alessandro Gagarides, let me start with you. We have seen Russian troops meeting many goals, especially in the east of Ukraine, as more than 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers surrendered. Is this the beginning of the collapse of Ukrainian resistance in the region, according to you?
Well, it is still early to talk about a complete collapse. Of course, 1,000 more soldiers are not a negligible number, but still in the great scheme of things, they are not a huge number either, which means that it will still take time for the Russian to completely break through the Ukrainian defenses. Also because we have seen that the Russian military has considerable problems in terms of logistics, morale, and training that will not be easily to solve in the short term. Well, it is surely progress for the Russian forces, especially towards the objective of seizing Donbass, but still it is not at the current stage a sign that Ukrainian defenses are completely collapsing. It could be, but it still needs to push more for that to happen.
Indeed. Dr. Kevin Rila, U.S. President Joe Biden welcomed congressional passage of $40 billion in aid for Ukraine and announced a new package of weapons he said would be sent directly to the front lines. A top Kremlin official also said Russia is intent on taking all the Donetsk and Luhansk region of Ukraine. Do you think that U.S. aids will keep Ukrainian resistance strong and halt Russian movement anyways?
First of all, I would redirect the question a little bit. This isn't really about U.S. aid to Ukraine. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has, if nothing else, unified a number of countries behind the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So, yes, those U.S. weapons will provide a significant support to the Ukrainian resistance, but though that joins along with weapons from a number of other countries as well. And as that support all combines together, it will provide significant strength to the Russian resistance movement.
And without heavy weaponry, do you think that Ukraine is really able to resist Russia, whose artillery are far stronger?
the heavy weaponry is making a difference. There's no question about it. It is a requirement for that heavy weaponry to be there. So yes, the support that that Ukraine is receiving from the West is having an impact.
Mm-hmm. And say such heavy weaponry were provided, wouldn't this provoke Russia a little further?
Well, that weaponry has already been there since the beginning of the conflict on the 24th of February. Russia has talked about it being a provocation, but at this point, Russia has not been able to do anything to stop that weaponry from moving into Ukraine. So yes, it has been a significant irritant, but Russia has not been able to stop it at this point.
All right, clear enough. Moving on now, National Security Advisor to President Joe Biden said on Wednesday that the United States is confident that Sweden and Finland will have an effective procedure for joining NATO and that Turkey's concerns can be addressed.
We're confident that at the end of the day, Finland and Sweden will have an effective and efficient accession process, that Turkey's concerns can be addressed. Finland and Sweden are working directly with Turkey to do this, but we're also talking to the Turks to try to help facilitate. The United States is prepared to send a very clear message, as are all of our European allies, that we will not tolerate any aggression against Finland or Sweden during this process.
The United States strongly supports Sweden's application for NATO membership. Our two militaries routinely exercise together. Your capabilities are modern, relevant, and significant. And your addition to the alliance will make us all better at defending ourselves.
Still with you, Dr. Kevin Reela. Just when it seemed like Finland and Sweden's accession into NATO was imminent, Turkey has taken its allies by surprise by throwing a wrench into the works. Analysts say that Turkey's veto in NATO may be used as leverage, not just against the Nordic countries, but against future members too. What do you think about that? Every
country has a balance of internal domestic concerns as well as external threat concerns. If Russia's invasion of Ukraine has done anything, the result has been that it has unified many countries together along those external threat concerns. Turkey is considering its internal domestic concerns in its statement about Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO. And that those concerns are valid. But there is undoubtedly, as the U.S. National Security Advisor said, a vigorous diplomatic discussion going on behind the scenes. And that diplomatic discussion is one in which multiple countries are talking to Turkey, as well as to Croatia. And that those domestic concerns can clearly be addressed in that diplomatic dialogue. At the same time, though, Russia is also vigorously exerting its diplomatic pressure on other countries to try to accentuate those domestic divisions. And Russia has, for many years, had as one of its major objectives the division and disruption of NATO. So Russia will do everything it can to accentuate those domestic concerns while NATO countries are working with Turkey in order to address them.
So are you insinuating that Turkey perhaps is using these domestic concerns just as a pretext to be aligned with Moscow?
No, not necessarily to be aligned with Moscow. It's using its domestic concerns as any country does in order to get those concerns on the table. And it is as those concerns are on the table and being discussed, then they can be addressed more effectively. However, Russia will exploit those concerns to its advantage.
So you think that perhaps these Kurd groups that Turkey is calling a terrorist group actually is going to be on its advantage? I mean, you think that these Nordic countries are going to side with Turkey so as to join NATO?
I won't speak on behalf of Sweden and NATO, Sweden and Finland. I don't know what they will do, but I think the discussion will be there, and that the concerns that Turkey has had for many years, not just since the invasion of Ukraine, that those concerns will be much more on the table than they have been before. How Sweden and Finland address those concerns, I don't know, but they will certainly be more open to talking about them.
Very nice indeed. Thank you. Mr. Alessandro Gargarides, how challenging would it be for the alliance to defend the two countries, Finland and Sweden, that is, who possess large geographic areas, archipelagos, and forests?
Well, for sure it will not be easy, but it's also not impossible, and NATO can do it. Finnish and Swedish forces are already pretty well trained. Even if they have a rather small military, as I was saying, they are pretty well trained, well equipped, and they are very, very close to NATO standards and are used to operate together. There is already a pretty high level of integration between their militaries and the NATO militaries. So in case they join, it will be possible in a relatively short time to complete the integration process and facilitate the defense of these two countries. The main problem here is that Finland and Sweden have expressed hesitations on the matter of hosting permanently bases and military forces from NATO countries on their soil. This, of course, in case of an attack, would complicate issues because it would require NATO allies to dispatch their forces to the attacked country, which of course takes time, requires a logistical organization, and is challenging to execute in a short time, especially for a nation under attack. Of course, this is what NATO is about, and the alliance must be ready to face this eventuality. But of course, it also represents a challenge. That said, as I was saying, the defense of these two countries is possible, also because, again, we have seen that Russia's offensive capabilities are not as strong as many believed them to be before the Ukrainian invasion. And considering that the war in Ukraine is still dragging on, at the current stage, it will be very hard for Russia to mount a conventional attack on these two countries. And even in the future, considering the high losses that Russia has suffered, it will take time for an offensive operation to be organized on Russia's side.
All right, moving on to the latest regarding NATO membership bid. US President Joe Biden says Sweden and Finland meet all the criteria to join NATO during a visit by Swedish Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson and Finnish President Sauli Niinisto to the White House. Let's follow this report and then we get back to the discussion.
Joe Biden said Thursday that Sweden and Finland, whose leaders he received at the White House, are ready to join NATO. After speaking the Oval Office with the Swedish Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson and the Finnish President Sauli Niinisto.
Sweden and Finland have strong democratic institutions, strong militaries, and strong and transparent economies, and a strong moral sense of what is right. They meet every NATO requirement, and then some.
The American president repeated in the famous Rose Garden of the White House, decked out in the colors of the three countries, that the United States would work with the two Nordic countries to face any aggression, which they could be the object of during their membership process.
That we're going to work together to remain vigilant against the threats to our shared security and deter and confront any aggression, while Finland and Sweden are in this accession process.
Swedish Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson said that the dialogue was underway with Turkey to resolve any issue.
And we are right now having a dialogue with all NATO member countries, including Turkey, on different levels to sort out any issues at hand.
In turn, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg emphasized that NATO is also ready to respond to the concerns put forward by Turkey to block membership applications of Sweden and Finland.
Of course, we are addressing the concerns that Turkey has expressed, because when an important ally as Turkey raises security concerns, raises issues, then of course the only way to deal with that is to sit down and find ways to find a common ground and an agreement on how to move forward.
By inviting the two leaders to Washington the day after their formal candidacy, the United States is once again showing its impatience to see the expansion of an alliance of which they are in fact the pilots. An expansion that resulted in a destructive conflict between Russia and Ukraine and will have severe repercussions in the near future, according to a lot of experts. While the vast majority of NATO members' countries share this enthusiasm, Turkey is still threatening to block the whole process.
PKK, YPG terör örgütüne.
Still with you, Mr. Alessandro Gargarides. 3 months ago, the two Nordic countries showed their disinterest in joining NATO and affirmed their neutrality. But now they submitted their application to join the alliance. What are your observations regarding this radical change in their position in particular?
Well, of course, this is largely explained by the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis and the war taking place there. It has been a shock for many people around the world and many countries. And in the case of Finland and Sweden, who are very close to Russia, in the case of Finland, a direct neighbor with a long border with Russia, this came, of course, as a shock, and some would even say a wake-up call that is time to join the alliance. So it is basically a change of perception regarding the threat posed by Russia. Of course, before they still regarded this as a potential threat, but they still believed that through diplomacy and crisis management, it would still be possible to keep the Russian calm, so to speak. But the Ukraine war demonstrated that Russia is willing to use its military force to pursue its foreign policy goals. And as I was saying, this changes the perception in Finland and Sweden about NATO membership to the point of actually applying to the alliance. That said, it will be said how Russia will react as the application process carries on, and provided it continues to go on and overcome the Turkish veto.
Very nice indeed, thank you. Dr. Kevin Riehl, Moscow started its adventure based on Ukraine using the pretext of NATO expansion. Now that Finland shares with it like 1,300 kilometers of borders with Russia, is about to join NATO, what will be the repercussions of this decision in your opinion?
Russia has little it can do to prevent this from happening. Russia, the Finnish and Swedish militaries are significantly stronger even than Ukraine's was at the beginning of this conflict. So Russia has little capability to actually prevent either Sweden or Finland from joining NATO. Russia can express its very strong opposition in rhetoric, but as it comes to military response, the performance of Russia's military in Ukraine shows that when it comes to fighting an even more modernized military that both Sweden and Finland possess, in addition to the security and guarantees that come with NATO membership, Russia has little it can do. Russia, not long ago, reportedly, according to Swedish press, flew an aircraft over Swedish airspace, and that aircraft was carrying nuclear-tipped missiles. That was a pretty clear message that Russia was trying to send. It didn't fire those missiles, but it just had to carry them in order to send that message. But short of that strong message, there's little Russia can do.
So you're saying that the warnings that Sergei Lavrov gave, or the official position of Russia regarding this NATO membership, is just void warning?
Russia's language is very strong, but as it comes to military response, I think there's not much Russia can do. Yes,
so you do not foresee a clash like anytime soon between Russia and the NATO alliance?
That is up to Russia, really. But no, I don't see a clash coming in the near future, because at this point, as this conflict began, no NATO territory has actually been penetrated. With Finland particularly joining NATO, with, as you mentioned, the long border with Russia, it would require a very different calculus on Russia's part in order to start anything militarily with Finland, and it would prompt a catastrophic response that Russia is not ready to receive.
Thank you indeed. US President Joe Biden's arrived in Seoul, making not only the start of his first visit while in office to South Korea and Japan, but the beginnings of an economic initiative aimed at deepening United States ties across Asia. Mr. Alessandro Gargarides, the U.S. has forged a united front with democratic allies that has combined their economic heft to make Russia pay a price for its invasion of Ukraine and to serve as a counterweight to China's ambitions. The Biden administration has warned China against assisting Russia in its war with Ukraine. Earlier, U.S. informed Asian and European allies that American intelligence determined that China had signaled to Russia a willingness to provide military support and financial backing to reduce the blow of severe sanctions imposed by the U.S. and its allies. Do you think that China's support to Russia would stop the efficiency or the efficacy of EU sanctions against Moscow? Is Biden's endeavor to strengthen relations with Asian allies will bring him more support for this policy amid the Russo-Ukrainian conflict?
Well, this largely depends on how much China will actually be willing to support Russia. And until now, we have seen that this support in practice has been rather limited. Sure, China has not condemned Russia's invasion, and it's still Chinese media broadcast the Russian narrative about the conflict. But other than that, we have not seen a lot of concrete action on China's part. That said, it is possible that things will change in the future, even though I personally believe that China will still be hesitant in openly in doing so and becoming involved in the matter, since it has other national security interests and priorities that it wants to pursue without having to alienate right now the United States, considering the already tense relations between them. Of course, the friendship with Russia with China can allow Russia to at least partially offset the effect of economic sanctions imposed by the West. Because especially in the long term, trade can be redirected, legal gaps can be found, and so on. But still, the sanctions will hit and will be effective in damaging the Russian economy. And the partnership with China will not be enough to completely overcome these, at least in the short and medium term. As for Biden's and his effort to improve relations with Asian partners, yes, I think that it is part of America's broader policy to improve the effectiveness of economic sanctions by involving Asian partners as well in the sanctions against Russia, again as a mean to maximize their effectiveness. That said, considering that China and other countries are not going to support this policy, there will be still some room for maneuver for the Russians to limit the effects of economic sanctions.
Many thanks indeed. Dr. Kevin Rila, in terms of economic power, the US slightly lags China in the Pacific, according to analysts. They show a possibility that a trade pact could magnify the combined power of the US and its allies relative to China. Biden's challenge is that the IPEF would not necessarily cut tariff rates or give allied signatories greater access to US markets, something Asian countries seek. How would the trade relations between the US and ASEAN countries would affect Russia's economy? I mean, Biden's Asia trip is expected to show in living color that US can take on China and Russia. Do you think that this will be feasible?
China is an economic power in the Pacific. Russia is not necessarily an economic power in the Pacific. If the United States, as it can grow its relations with countries in the Pacific and elsewhere, it can grow its own power as well. And as the United States attempts to take advantage of the strong relationships that it has in places like Korea and Japan, it will, as Alessandro just said, reduce the maneuverability of both Russia and China in East Asia. I mean, the idea is that the United States is also a Pacific power. That has been a discussion not just in this administration, but in previous administrations. And as the United States expresses its relation, or it tries to strengthen its relations in the Pacific, it does so with the intent of counterweighing the forces that are against the United States there. So yes, in the United States, it is feasible for the United States to do that. It has an uphill battle in order to accomplish it.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the sanctions perhaps imposed by the West on Russia could be cushioned by the traditional allies of Russia?
Russia's primary exports are oil and gas.
Mm-hmm.
As oil and gas can be, as other countries can find other sources for oil and gas, mm-hmm. that will significantly affect Russia's abilities to sell its products. So yes, Russia has traditional allies, and Russia is not 100% isolated in the world. But as those countries find other sources of oil and gas, even whether it's the United States or other countries, then that would have an effect on Russia's economy.
Mm-hmm. Any final word, Mr. Alessandro?
But we can add that the recent efforts to launch the IPEF can be seen as a manner by the United States to re-engage economically in the region. This, of course, can have an effect, but only in the long term, because it will require, of course, negotiations. And also it is important to note that IPEF is not a free trade agreement as considered in the traditional sense. Actually, it is not, because it is not going to lower trade tariffs. But still, it is a signal of US willingness. That said, it will take time, and at the current stage, it is not offering much incentives to partners in the region, especially in Southeast Asia, to join, since the Biden administration does not seem willing to give more access to the US market out of fear of damaging US workers.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Million thanks
thing.
indeed. Thank you, dear guests, for your thorough analysis and vivid discussion. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. That's all we have for now. Bye.
Thank you, dear guests, for joining us today. It was such a pleasure, Mr. Kevin, Mr. Alexander. Thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you for
My
the
pleasure.
invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Such a pleasure.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Have a good